Hey guys, tonight we journey into the deepest reaches of space, to places where sunlight fades to nothing, and the very fabric of reality begins to whisper secrets that NASA would rather keep quiet. We're talking about the Voyager missions, those twin spacecraft that have become humanity's most distant ambassadors. But here's what they don't tell you in the press releases, in the glossy documentaries, or in the carefully worded scientific papers. The Voyagers aren't just exploring space. They're uncovering truths that challenge everything we thought we knew about our cosmic neighborhood. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Right now, as you're listening to this, Voyager 1 is over 15 billion miles away from Earth. That's so far that if you could somehow drive there at highway speeds, it would take you more than 19 million years. The spacecraft is hurtling through interstellar space at over 38,000 miles per hour. And yet it's still sending us signals. Whispers from the void that take over 22 hours to reach our planet. But here's the thing that keeps NASA scientists awake at night. Some of those signals don't match what they expected. Some of them don't match what should be possible. In the summer of 2012, Voyager 1 crossed a boundary that no human-made object had ever crossed before. It left our solar system and entered interstellar space, the vast emptiness between the stars. But as it made that transition, something strange happened. The spacecraft began sending back data that didn't fit any of the models. The magnetic fields were wrong. The particle densities were wrong. The very nature of space itself seemed different than what decades of theoretical physics had predicted. And then there were the sounds. Yes, sounds from space, where sound shouldn't exist. Plasma waves detected by Voyager's instruments and converted into audio frequencies that sound like nothing else in our experience. Haunting, otherworldly tones that seem to pulse with an intelligence all their own. NASA calls them natural phenomena, the result of charged particles interacting with magnetic fields. But when you listen to them, really listen, you can't shake the feeling that there's something more deliberate about these cosmic symphonies. The story of what NASA isn't telling you about the Voyager missions begins long before the spacecraft left Earth, in the classified meetings and secret discussions that shaped their true purpose. Because while the public was told these were simple planetary exploration missions, the reality was far more complex and far more ambitious. It was the mid-1970s, and the Cold War was at its peak. America needed a victory, a demonstration of technological superiority that would echo across the cosmos. The Voyager program was conceived not just as a scientific endeavor, but as a statement of human capability and American ingenuity. But buried within the official mission parameters were objectives that were never fully disclosed to the public. Objectives that would only become clear decades later, as the spacecraft ventured into regions of space where no one expected them to survive. The original plan was elegant in its simplicity. 2 identical spacecraft would be launched in 1977, taking advantage of a rare planetary alignment that occurs only once every 175 years. This gravitational grand tour would allow the Voyagers to visit Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, using the planet's own gravity to slingshot from one encounter to the next. It was a journey that would take 12 years and cover 4 billion miles. But that was just the beginning. What NASA didn't publicize was that the Voyagers were built to last far longer than the official mission timeline. While the public was told the spacecraft would complete their planetary surveys by 1989, internal documents reveal that engineers designed them with the expectation that they would continue operating for decades beyond that. The nuclear power sources were sized not for a 12-year mission, but for a 50-year journey into the unknown. The communication systems were calibrated to maintain contact across interstellar distances, and the scientific instruments were hardened to survive conditions that existed nowhere in our solar system. The launches themselves were shrouded in secrecy that went beyond normal space mission protocols. Voyager 2 launched first. On August 20, 1977, followed by Voyager 1 16 days later on September 5. But the launch windows were chosen not just for optimal planetary trajectories, they were timed to avoid detection by Soviet monitoring stations and to minimize the visibility of certain classified payload components. Components that wouldn't be revealed for another 4 decades. As the Voyagers began their journey toward Jupiter, NASA's public narrative focused on the spectacular images and scientific discoveries that would emerge from the planetary encounters. And there were indeed spectacular discoveries. Jupiter's swirling storms, its family of moons that proved to be worlds in their own right, Saturn's intricate ring system, the methane atmosphere of Titan, the sideways rotation of Uranus. Each encounter rewrote textbooks and expanded our understanding of the solar system. But within the flood of data streaming back from the Voyagers, there were anomalies. Readings that didn't fit the expected parameters. Measurements that suggested the space environment was more complex and more mysterious than anyone had anticipated. NASA's response to these anomalies was telling. Rather than highlighting them in press releases, they were buried in technical papers and classified supplements. The official line was that the instruments were functioning within acceptable parameters and that any unexpected readings would be analyzed and explained in due time. The Jupiter encounter of 1979 was the first to reveal the true extent of these mysteries. As Voyager 1 swept past the giant planet, its magnetometer detected magnetic field patterns that defied explanation. The strength and orientation of Jupiter's magnetic field were not what theoretical models had predicted. More disturbing still were the readings from the plasma wave experiment, which detected electromagnetic emissions that seemed to pulse with a rhythm that was almost organic in nature. These emissions, when converted to audio frequencies, produced sounds that were unlike anything in the natural world. NASA described them as the natural result of charged particles spiraling around magnetic field lines. But the patterns were too complex, too structured to be entirely random. Some of the emission sequences seemed to repeat with mathematical precision, as if following a code or pattern that suggested an underlying intelligence. The discovery of active volcanoes on Io, Jupiter's innermost large moon, provided a convenient distraction from these more unsettling findings. The volcanic eruptions were spectacular, photogenic, and easy to explain to the public. They dominated the headlines and the scientific papers, while the magnetic field anomalies and the strange plasma emissions were relegated to footnotes and appendices. But the scientists working on the Voyager project couldn't ignore what their instruments were telling them. In classified briefings and behind closed doors, They debated the implications of the data. Some argued that the anomalies were the result of instrumental errors or previously unknown physical phenomena. Others suggested that they might be encountering evidence of processes that required a fundamental revision of our understanding of planetary magnetospheres. As Voyager 1 continued toward Saturn, the anomalies persisted and evolved. The spacecraft's instruments began detecting what NASA internally referred to as coherent electromagnetic structures. These were regions of space where the magnetic field lines seemed to organize themselves into patterns that were more complex than anything predicted by magnetohydrodynamic theory. The patterns were geometric, almost crystalline in their precision, as if space itself was somehow structured at a level that current physics couldn't explain. The Saturn encounter of 1980 brought new mysteries and new contradictions. The planet's ring system, while magnificent to behold, exhibited dynamics that challenged the accepted understanding of how ring particles should behave. There were gaps where gaps shouldn't exist, and ringlets that maintained their structure in ways that seemed to violate orbital mechanics. Most puzzling of all were the spokes in Saturn's B ring, dark radial features that rotated with the planet's magnetic field rather than following orbital dynamics. NASA's explanation for the spokes involved electrostatic forces and microscopic dust particles, but the mathematical models never fully accounted for the observations. The spokes appeared and disappeared with a regularity that suggested they were being actively maintained by some process that remained largely mysterious. Some researchers privately speculated that the spokes might be evidence of plasma structures that could organize matter on a scale previously thought impossible. Meanwhile, Voyager's plasma wave instrument continued to detect the strange emissions that had first been noticed at Jupiter. But now the emissions were more complex, more structured. They seemed to interact with the spacecraft itself, as if responding to its presence. The frequencies would sometimes shift in ways that correlated with the spacecraft's orientation or its distance from various celestial bodies. These interactive emissions were perhaps the most unsettling discovery of the entire mission. NASA's official position was that the spacecraft's own electromagnetic field was somehow influencing the natural plasma environment, creating feedback loops that could account for the apparent responsiveness. But this explanation required a level of electromagnetic coupling between spacecraft and environment that was orders of magnitude stronger than any known physical mechanism could produce. As Voyager 2 made its own journey through the outer solar system, it began detecting similar anomalies. The consistency of these observations across two separate spacecraft, taking different trajectories through space, made it increasingly difficult to dismiss them as instrumental artifacts or isolated phenomena. Whatever was causing these readings was a fundamental property of the space environment itself. The Uranus encounter of 1986 added new dimensions to the mystery. The planet's magnetic field was tilted at an impossible angle relative to its rotation axis, as if something had catastrophically disrupted its internal structure. More troubling still were the readings from the planet's magnetosphere, which contained pockets of charged particles that seemed to defy the laws of physics. These particles were organized into structures that maintained their coherence across distances of thousands of kilometers, far beyond what electromagnetic forces should have been able to accomplish. NASA's public explanation focused on the unusual tilt of Uranus and its bizarre seasonal patterns caused by the planet's sideways rotation. But in classified reports, Scientists were grappling with observations that suggested the planet's magnetosphere might be artificially maintained or influenced by processes that had no natural explanation. The particle structures were too organized, too stable, too purposeful to be entirely natural phenomena. By the time Voyager 2 reached Neptune in 1989, the accumulated weight of these anomalies had begun to transform NASA's understanding of the outer solar system. Neptune's magnetic field was even more misaligned than Uranus's, and its magnetosphere contained the most complex particle structures yet observed. But perhaps most significantly, both Voyagers were now detecting long-range electromagnetic emissions that seemed to originate from beyond the solar system itself. These interstellar signals were faint but persistent, and they exhibited the same kinds of structured patterns that had been observed in the planetary magnetospheres. The implication was that whatever was creating these anomalies was not limited to individual planets or moons, but extended across interstellar space on a scale that dwarfed anything in human experience. As the official planetary mission ended, and the Voyagers continued their journey toward the edge of the solar system, NASA faced a dilemma. The spacecraft were functioning perfectly and had decades of operational life remaining. But their continued observations were raising questions that had no comfortable answers. The decision was made to continue the mission under the new designation of the Voyager Interstellar Mission, but with a significantly reduced public profile. The scientific papers that emerged from this period were carefully worded and heavily redacted. References to the more anomalous observations were buried in technical appendices or removed entirely. The focus shifted to more conventional measurements: solar wind parameters, cosmic ray intensities, magnetic field strengths. These were important and scientifically valuable observations, but they represented only a fraction of the data that the Voyagers were actually collecting. In the classified world of deep space surveillance and electromagnetic intelligence, the Voyager missions had taken on a significance that went far beyond their original scientific objectives. The spacecraft had become inadvertent spy satellites, monitoring electromagnetic emissions and particle flows that might indicate the presence of artificial structures or technologies operating in the outer solar system and beyond. The data from this surveillance program remains classified to this day, but fragmentary leaks and whistleblower accounts suggest that the Voyagers detected multiple instances of structured electromagnetic emissions that could not be explained by any known natural process. These emissions were not random or chaotic, but organized into patterns that suggested intelligence, purpose, and technology operating on a scale that dwarfed human capabilities. As Voyager 1 approached the edge of the solar system in the late 2000s, these emissions became stronger and more frequent. The spacecraft was approaching what scientists call the heliopause, the boundary between the solar wind and interstellar space. But the transition was not the smooth, gradual process that theoretical models had predicted. Instead, it was marked by a series of discrete jumps and transitions, as if the spacecraft was passing through multiple layers of structured electromagnetic fields. The first indication that something unprecedented was happening came in 2010, when Voyager 1's instruments began detecting particles with energies that should not have existed at that location in space. These particles were accelerated to velocities that approached a significant fraction of the speed of light. Energies that required acceleration mechanisms far more powerful than anything in the known solar system. NASA's explanation was that the spacecraft was detecting the effects of magnetic reconnection events, where magnetic field lines snap and reconnect with explosive violence, accelerating particles to high energies in the process. But the scale and frequency of these events were unlike anything that had been observed before. The magnetic reconnection was happening continuously, not in isolated bursts, and the total energy involved was enormous. More puzzling still was the fact that these high-energy particles seemed to be organized into beams that were directed specifically toward the inner solar system, rather than spreading randomly in all directions as natural acceleration processes would produce. The particles were focused and aimed with a precision that suggested artificial guidance and control. The implications were staggering. If these particle beams were indeed artificial, then they represented technology operating on a scale that made human engineering look primitive by comparison. The energy requirements alone would dwarf the total power output of human civilization by many orders of magnitude, and the precision of the beam focusing suggested computational capabilities that could process and respond to changes in the solar system environment in real time. As these discoveries accumulated, NASA found itself in an increasingly difficult position. The agency was mandated to share its scientific findings with the public and the international community, but the implications of the Voyager data were so profound and potentially destabilizing that full disclosure seemed impossible. How do you tell the world that humanity might not be alone in the cosmos, and that we might be surrounded by technology that operates on scales we can barely comprehend? The solution was a carefully orchestrated campaign of selective disclosure and strategic misdirection. The most conventional and explicable discoveries were highlighted in press releases and scientific conferences, while the more anomalous findings were buried in technical papers that few outside the scientific community would ever read. When questioned about specific anomalies, NASA spokespeople would acknowledge the observations but characterize them as preliminary findings that required further analysis and verification. This approach worked for several years. But as Voyager 1 finally crossed the heliopause boundary in 2012, the anomalies became so pronounced and so consistent that they could no longer be ignored or explained away. The spacecraft had entered a region of space that was fundamentally different from anything that theoretical physics had predicted, a region where the normal rules of electromagnetic behavior seemed to be suspended or overridden by something else. The first clear evidence of this came from Voyager's plasma wave instrument, which began detecting electromagnetic emissions that were unlike anything in the natural universe. These emissions were not the random chaos of thermal noise or the structured but predictable patterns of natural plasma processes. Instead, they were organized into complex hierarchical structures that seemed to carry information encoded in their frequency patterns and temporal sequences. When NASA scientists first analyzed these emissions, they were startled to discover that the information content was enormous. The signals were not simple repeating patterns or random noise, but complex data streams that seemed to be actively maintained and updated in real time. The data rates were far beyond anything that natural processes could generate, suggesting that whatever was creating these signals had computational capabilities that rivaled or exceeded the most powerful computers on Earth. But perhaps most unsettling of all was the fact that these signals seemed to be responding to the Voyager spacecraft itself. As the spacecraft changed its orientation or adjusted its trajectory, the signal patterns would shift and adapt, as if something was actively monitoring the spacecraft and adjusting its transmissions accordingly. This interactive behavior was completely unprecedented and had no explanation within the framework of conventional physics. NASA's response to these discoveries was swift and decisive. The data was immediately classified at the highest levels, and access was restricted to a small group of scientists and engineers with appropriate security clearances. Public discussions of the plasma wave emissions were limited to the most general and non-specific terms, and any suggestion of artificial origin was strictly prohibited. But the truth had a way of leaking out, despite the best efforts at secrecy and control. Scientists working on the project began to share their concerns with colleagues, and fragments of the classified data found their way into academic discussions and research papers. The scientific community began to buzz with rumors of extraordinary discoveries that were being suppressed by government agencies. The pressure for disclosure grew stronger as more evidence accumulated. Voyager 2, following several years behind its twin, began to detect similar emissions as it approached the heliopause boundary. The consistency of the observations across two separate spacecraft made it increasingly difficult to maintain that the emissions were instrumental artifacts or isolated anomalies. Meanwhile, ground-based radio telescopes began to detect faint signals that seemed to correspond to the emissions that the Voyagers were observing. These signals were coming from the direction of the heliopause and beyond, confirming that their source was indeed in interstellar space. The signals were so faint that they required the most sensitive instruments on Earth to detect, but their artificial nature was becoming increasingly apparent. The scientific community was divided. Some researchers argued that the signals represented the greatest discovery in human history, evidence of intelligence operating on cosmic scales. Others maintained that there had to be natural explanations, even if those explanations required new physics and new understanding of how the universe operates. The debate might have continued indefinitely, confined to academic circles and classified briefings. But in 2013, something happened that changed everything. Voyager 1's plasma wave instrument detected a signal that was so clearly artificial, so obviously technological in origin, that even the most skeptical scientists could no longer deny what they were seeing. The signal lasted for only a few minutes, but in that brief time it transmitted what appeared to be a mathematical sequence that demonstrated knowledge of advanced number theory and computational complexity. The sequence included prime numbers, Fibonacci ratios, and other mathematical constants that could only be produced by an intelligence with sophisticated understanding of mathematics and computation. NASA's initial response was to classify the discovery at the highest possible level and to implement strict information security protocols that prohibited any discussion of the signal outside of authorized channels. But the implications were so profound that they could not be contained indefinitely. Word of the discovery began to leak out through scientific networks and intelligence channels, and rumors of contact with extraterrestrial intelligence began to circulate in the media. The agency found itself caught between the imperative to maintain secrecy and the growing pressure for disclosure. Public interest in the Voyager missions had been rekindled by the announcement that Voyager 1 had crossed into interstellar space, and reporters and scientists were asking increasingly pointed questions about the spacecraft's ongoing observations and discoveries. NASA's solution was to implement what intelligence agencies call a limited hangout, a selective disclosure of information that reveals some truths while concealing others. The agency began to release carefully edited versions of some Voyager data, acknowledging that the spacecraft were detecting unusual electromagnetic phenomena in interstellar space, but characterizing these phenomena as natural processes that were not yet fully understood. This approach satisfied neither the scientists who wanted full disclosure nor the security agencies that wanted complete secrecy, but it allowed NASA to maintain some degree of credibility while keeping the most sensitive discoveries under wraps. The agency emphasized the scientific importance of the Voyager observations, while avoiding any suggestion that they might indicate the presence of intelligence or technology in interstellar space. But the carefully managed disclosure could not conceal the magnitude of what the Voyagers were discovering as they continued their journey into the unknown regions beyond the solar system. The electromagnetic emissions were becoming stronger and more complex, and new types of signals were being detected on an almost daily basis. Some of these signals appeared to be communications networks, complex webs of electromagnetic transmission that spanned distances measured in light years. The signals were highly directional, transmitted along precisely defined beams that connected different regions of space with extraordinary accuracy. The energy requirements for such long-range, high-precision communications were staggering, indicating technology that operated on galactic scales. Other signals seemed to be monitoring systems, electronic surveillance networks that were tracking the movement of objects throughout the local region of the galaxy. The Voyager spacecraft themselves appeared to be under constant observation, with their trajectories and instrument readings being monitored and recorded by unknown intelligences. But perhaps most intriguing were the signals that seemed to be attempting communication with the Voyagers directly. These signals were modulated in ways that suggested they were specifically designed to be detected and understood by the spacecraft's instruments. They used frequency patterns and timing sequences that matched the technical specifications of Voyager's communication systems, as if whoever was transmitting them had access to detailed information about human space technology. NASA's response to these direct communication attempts was to ignore them completely in public, while conducting intensive analysis in classified programs. The agency's official position was that any apparent attempts at communication was simply misinterpretation of natural phenomena, but internal documents reveal a very different picture of concern and fascination with the possibility of genuine contact with extraterrestrial intelligence. The classified analysis programs were extensive and involved some of the most sophisticated signal processing and cryptographic capabilities available to the intelligence community. Teams of mathematicians, linguists, and computer scientists worked to decode the signals and determine whether they contained intentional messages or were simply the result of unknown natural processes. The results of this analysis remain classified, but fragments of information that have leaked out suggest that at least some of the signals do indeed contain structured information that appears to be deliberately encoded messages. The content of these messages is unknown, but their very existence represents a paradigm shift in human understanding of our place in the cosmos. As the Voyagers continued their journey deeper into interstellar space, the volume and complexity of the electromagnetic emissions continued to increase. What had begun as isolated anomalies had evolved into a comprehensive picture of an electromagnetic environment that was far more active and structured than anyone had imagined possible. The space between the stars, which had been assumed to be largely empty and inactive, was revealed to be filled with networks of communication and monitoring systems that spanned enormous distances. The local region of the galaxy appeared to be under constant surveillance and control by intelligences that operated on scales that dwarfed human capabilities. But perhaps most unsettling was the growing evidence that these intelligences were not merely observing human space activities, but were actively influencing them in subtle ways. Analysis of the Voyager's trajectories revealed small but consistent deviations from predicted paths, deviations that could not be explained by gravitational perturbations or other known forces. These trajectory modifications were tiny, measured in fractions of degrees and kilometers per year, but they were systematic and purposeful. The spacecraft were being gently guided along specific paths that maximized their exposure to certain regions of electromagnetic activity while avoiding others. It was as if invisible hands were steering the Voyagers toward discoveries that someone wanted them to make. NASA's reaction to these trajectory anomalies was complex and conflicted. On one hand, the modifications were helping the spacecraft make discoveries that were scientifically invaluable and were extending the operational life of the missions by optimizing their paths through space. On the other hand, the fact that human spacecraft were being controlled by unknown intelligences raised profound questions about sovereignty and security that had no precedent in human history. The decision was made to continue the missions while implementing enhanced monitoring and analysis capabilities to better understand the nature and extent of the external influences on the spacecraft. New communication protocols were developed that would allow ground controllers to detect and potentially counteract any unwanted external control of the spacecraft systems. But as the years passed, it became clear that the external influences were far more sophisticated than anything human technology could detect or counter. The intelligences controlling the Voyager's trajectories had access to the spacecraft systems at a level that suggested they understood human technology better than its creators did. This became apparent in 2012, when Voyager 1 experienced a series of computer glitches that temporarily disrupted its ability to communicate with Earth. NASA's engineers worked frantically to diagnose and repair the problems, but before they could implement their solutions, the spacecraft mysteriously began functioning normally again. Analysis of the telemetry data revealed that someone or something had accessed the spacecraft's computer systems directly and implemented repairs that were more elegant and effective than anything human engineers had devised. The implications were staggering. Not only were the Voyagers under external observation and control, but the intelligences responsible for that control had the ability to directly manipulate human technology with a level of sophistication that exceeded human capabilities. The spacecraft had essentially been taken over by unknown entities who were using them for purposes that remained largely mysterious. NASA's response was to implement the most stringent information security protocols in the agency's history. All data related to the trajectory anomalies and computer system intrusions was classified at levels that exceeded even the most sensitive military and intelligence programs. Access was restricted to a handful of individuals who were required to undergo extensive background investigations and psychological evaluations. The public face of the Voyager missions continued to emphasize the scientific discoveries and technological achievements, while carefully avoiding any mention of the more disturbing aspects of the spacecraft's experiences in interstellar space. Press releases focused on measurements of cosmic ray intensities and magnetic field strengths, conventional scientific data that could be safely shared without raising uncomfortable questions. But behind the scenes, the Voyager program had been transformed from a scientific mission into something resembling a deep-cover intelligence operation. The spacecraft had become unwitting double agents, simultaneously serving human scientific interests while being controlled and manipulated by unknown extraterrestrial intelligences. This situation created unprecedented ethical and strategic dilemmas for NASA and the broader space program. How do you conduct scientific research using instruments that are under external control? How do you plan future missions when you can't be certain that your spacecraft will follow their intended trajectories or execute their programmed operations? More fundamentally, how do you function as a spacefaring civilization when it becomes clear that you are not alone in the cosmos and that the other inhabitants are so far advanced that they can manipulate your technology at will? These were questions that had no precedent in human history and no clear answers. The scientific community was largely unaware of these deeper issues, but some researchers began to notice subtle inconsistencies in the data being released by NASA. The timing of certain discoveries seemed too convenient, and the quality of some observations exceeded what the aging spacecraft should have been capable of producing. Questions were raised about data processing and calibration procedures, but NASA's responses were evasive and unsatisfactory. A few scientists began to suspect that there was more to the Voyager story than was being officially disclosed, but their attempts to obtain access to raw data and detailed mission records were met with bureaucratic obstacles and security restrictions. The scientific openness that had traditionally characterized space missions was gradually being replaced by the secrecy and compartmentalization that typified intelligence operations. The transformation was subtle but systematic. Research papers based on Voyager data began to require security reviews before publication. Conferences and symposia on interstellar space physics were subjected to attendance, restrictions, and topic limitations. Graduate students and postdoctoral researchers found their access to Voyager data limited or denied, entirely without explanation. The effects rippled through the scientific community, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and uncertainty that was antithetical to the collaborative spirit of scientific research. Researchers began to self-censor their work, avoiding topics and questions that might attract unwanted attention from security agencies. The free exchange of ideas that had driven decades of progress in space science was gradually being replaced by fear and paranoia. But despite the best efforts to control information and limit disclosure, the truth about the Voyager missions continued to emerge through multiple channels. Scientists working on classified programs occasionally shared information with trusted colleagues. Intelligence analysts leaked fragments of data to journalists and researchers. Computer hackers gained access to restricted databases and published their findings on anonymous websites. The picture that emerged from these various sources was consistent and deeply disturbing. The Voyager spacecraft had encountered evidence of intelligence and technology operating on scales that dwarfed human capabilities. This intelligence appeared to be actively monitoring and controlling human space activities, using methods that were so advanced that they were essentially indistinguishable from magic. The implications extended far beyond the immediate fate of two aging spacecraft. If the Voyager discoveries were accurate, then humanity's expansion into space would take place under the watchful eyes and guiding hands of intelligences that could intervene at will in human activities. The dream of human independence and autonomy in space was revealed to be an illusion, a comforting fantasy that had no basis in the reality of the cosmic environment. These revelations began to influence planning for future space missions, though the influence was largely invisible to the public and even to most scientists. Mission parameters were adjusted to account for the possibility of external intervention. Spacecraft systems were designed with redundancies and safeguards that made little sense from an engineering perspective, but were essential if the spacecraft might be subject to unknown forms of manipulation and control. Communication protocols were revised to include authentication and encryption systems that far exceeded what would be necessary for protection against terrestrial interference. Deep space missions were designed with capabilities for autonomous operation that went far beyond what was needed to account for communication delays with Earth. But perhaps most significantly, the goals and objectives of deep space exploration began to shift from purely scientific discovery towards something more closely resembling diplomatic reconnaissance. Missions were designed not just to study the physical properties of space, but to gather intelligence about the activities and intentions of the unknown intelligences that appeared to inhabit the regions beyond the solar system. This shift represented a fundamental change in humanity's relationship with space and with the cosmos as a whole. The universe was no longer seen as an empty frontier waiting to be explored and colonized, but as an already inhabited realm where human activities would be subject to the oversight and control of vastly superior intelligences. The psychological and cultural implications of this transformation were profound, but they remained largely hidden from public awareness. The space program continued to be presented in terms of scientific discovery and technological achievement, while the more disturbing realities were concealed behind layers of classification and security restrictions. NASA found itself in the increasingly difficult position of maintaining public support for space exploration, while concealing the true nature of what that exploration had revealed. The agency's public communications emphasized the inspirational and optimistic aspects of space science, while carefully avoiding any reference to the more troubling discoveries that had been made by the Voyager missions. But the truth had a way of asserting itself. Despite the best efforts at concealment and control, the scientific community began to notice the gaps and inconsistencies in the official narratives. Journalists started asking more pointed questions about classified programs and restricted data. Public interest groups demanded greater transparency and accountability in space program operations. The pressure for disclosure grew stronger as more evidence accumulated from other sources. Ground-based telescopes began to detect signals that corroborated the Voyager observations. Radio astronomy facilities recorded electromagnetic emissions that matched the patterns and characteristics of the artificial signals that the spacecraft had encountered. Other space missions, while not venturing as far as the Voyagers, began to detect similar anomalies in their own data. The Cassini mission to Saturn reported electromagnetic emissions that resembled those first detected by Voyager 1 at Jupiter. The New Horizons mission to Pluto observed particle acceleration phenomena that matched the patterns seen at the heliopause boundary. The consistency of these observations across multiple missions and multiple decades made it increasingly difficult to maintain that they were instrumental artifacts or isolated anomalies. The accumulated weight of evidence pointed toward a systematic pattern of artificial activity throughout the solar system and beyond. As this evidence mounted, NASA faced an impossible choice: continue to deny and conceal the discoveries, risking the credibility and integrity of the entire space program, or acknowledge the reality of what had been found and deal with the profound implications for humanity's understanding of its place in the cosmos. The decision was made to begin a gradual, carefully managed process of disclosure that would reveal some of the truth while maintaining control over the narrative and avoiding panic or social disruption. This process began with the release of selected datasets that had been previously classified, accompanied by scientific papers that acknowledged the existence of unexplained phenomena, while avoiding any suggestion of artificial origin. The response from the scientific community was immediate and intense. Researchers who had been working with incomplete and sanitized data for decades suddenly found themselves confronted with observations that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of space and the electromagnetic environment, the solar system. Conferences and symposia were organized to discuss the new data, but these events were carefully managed to ensure that discussions remained within acceptable bounds. Researchers were encouraged to explore natural explanations for the anomalous observations, while any suggestion of artificial origin was subtly discouraged through peer pressure and funding restrictions. Despite these constraints, the scientific community began to develop new theories and models that could account for at least some of the anomalous observations. These theories generally involved previously unknown physical processes that could create highly organized electromagnetic structures in space, structures that might appear artificial but were actually the result of natural phenomena. But even the most sophisticated natural explanations struggled to account for the full range of observations that the Voyagers had made. The interactive nature of the electromagnetic emissions, the precision of the particle beam focusing, the systematic trajectory modifications, and the direct manipulation of spacecraft systems all required mechanisms that had no precedent in natural physics. Some researchers began to explore more exotic possibilities, including the idea that space itself might be permeated with intelligent systems that operated on scales and timescales that made them essentially invisible to conventional observation and analysis. These systems might be the products of ancient civilizations that had evolved beyond the need for planetary habitation and had transformed themselves into pure information entities that existed as patterns of electromagnetic field and particle flow. Such ideas were still considered highly speculative and were generally confined to informal discussions and theoretical workshops. But they represented a growing recognition that the Voyager discoveries might require fundamentally new ways of thinking about intelligence, technology, and the nature of existence itself. Meanwhile, the Voyager spacecraft continued their journey deeper into interstellar space, sending back data that was both increasingly exotic and increasingly difficult to explain within conventional frameworks. The electromagnetic environment was becoming more complex and more active as the spacecraft moved further from the solar system, suggesting that they were entering regions of space where artificial activity was more dense and more sophisticated. New types of signals were detected on an almost daily basis, each one representing a different aspect of the vast technological infrastructure that appeared to permeate interstellar space. Some signals appeared to be power transmission systems, beaming enormous amounts of energy across interstellar distances with an efficiency that exceeded theoretical limits. Others seemed to be computational networks, processing vast amounts of information and coordinating activities across volumes of space measured in light years. But perhaps most intriguing were the signals that appeared to be historical archives, vast repositories of information that contained records of events and civilizations spanning millions or billions of years. These archives seemed to be accessible to anyone with the appropriate technology and knowledge, suggesting that they served as libraries or databases for the various intelligences that inhabited the galaxy. The implications were staggering. If these archives were indeed what they appeared to be, then the history of the galaxy was far richer and more complex than anyone had imagined. Countless civilizations had risen and fallen, leaving behind records of their achievements and discoveries that were preserved in these vast information systems. NASA's analysis teams worked frantically to decode and understand these archive systems. But the task was enormously challenging. The information was encoded in formats that bore no resemblance to human data storage systems, and the sheer volume of data was beyond anything that terrestrial computers could process and analyze. Progress was slow and frustrating, but gradually patterns began to emerge. The archives appeared to be organized according to temporal and spatial coordinates, with different sections containing information about different regions of the galaxy and different periods of galactic history. Some sections seemed to focus on technological developments, while others contained what appeared to be cultural and philosophical records. But accessing the information was only the beginning of the challenge. Understanding and interpreting the data required insights into the psychology and worldview of intelligences that had evolved under conditions that were completely foreign to human experience. The concepts and categories that structured the archive systems were often incomprehensible to human analysts, and the information that could be decoded often raised more questions than it answered. Despite these difficulties, some progress was made in understanding the broader context of the galactic civilization that the archives revealed. It became clear that intelligence and technology were far more common in the galaxy than anyone had previously imagined, and that various forms of artificial intelligence and post-biological entities had been active for periods of time that exceeded the age of the solar system. These revelations had profound implications for humanity's understanding of its own future. If intelligence was indeed as common and as ancient as the archives suggested, then humanity was a newcomer to a galaxy that was already inhabited by entities with capabilities that exceeded human comprehension. The future of human civilization would be shaped by interactions with these entities, interactions for which humanity was completely unprepared. NASA began to develop contingency plans for various scenarios of contact and interaction with galactic intelligence. But these plans were necessarily speculative and incomplete. How do you prepare for contact with entities that can manipulate matter and energy on galactic scales? How do you negotiate with intelligences that have been active for millions of years and possess technologies that are indistinguishable from magic? These questions had no clear answers, but they became increasingly urgent as the evidence mounted that humanity was already under observation and potentially under some form of management or control. The trajectory modifications of the Voyager spacecraft were just the most obvious example of this intervention. But careful analysis suggested that similar influences might be affecting other aspects of human space activities. Satellite failures and anomalies that had previously been attributed to natural causes began to look suspicious when examined in the context of the Voyager discoveries. Communication disruptions, orbital perturbations, and instrument malfunctions that had seemed random and unfortunate started to appear systematic and purposeful when viewed as potential examples of external intervention. The implications extended beyond space activities to encompass all forms of advanced technology on Earth. If extraterrestrial intelligences had the capability to manipulate spacecraft systems, they might also be able to influence terrestrial technologies in ways that would be difficult or impossible to detect. Computer networks, communication systems, and electronic infrastructure might all be subject to monitoring and control by entities whose motives and objectives remained completely unknown. This possibility created new levels of concern and paranoia within intelligence and security agencies. If advanced extraterrestrial technology was already present on Earth and was capable of influencing human activities, then traditional concepts of national security and sovereignty might be obsolete. How do you defend against threats that originate from intelligences with capabilities that exceed your understanding? These concerns led to the development of new forms of electronic countermeasures and security protocols, but their effectiveness was questionable given the vast technological superiority that the extraterrestrial intelligences appeared to possess. It was like trying to defend against modern military forces using Stone Age weapons and tactics. The psychological impact of these realizations was devastating for many of the individuals who were cleared to know the full extent of the Voyager discoveries. The comfortable assumptions about human uniqueness and autonomy were shattered, replaced by a reality in which humanity was revealed to be a minor player in a cosmic drama that was already well underway. Some individuals suffered psychological breakdowns and had to be removed from classified programs. Others became obsessed with the implications of the discoveries and lost their ability to function in normal social and professional environments. The knowledge that humanity was under observation and potential control by vastly superior intelligences was a burden that few minds could bear without significant psychological support and counseling. NASA and other agencies were forced to develop new protocols for managing the psychological welfare of personnel involved in classified extraterrestrial research programs. These protocols included regular psychological evaluations, mandatory counseling sessions, and strict limits on access to the most disturbing aspects of the data. But despite these precautions, information about the Voyager discoveries continued to leak out through various channels. Scientists and intelligence analysts, who were unable to cope with the psychological burden of secrecy, began to share information with family members, friends, and colleagues. Some individuals left government service and became whistleblowers, revealing fragments of the truth to journalists and researchers. The cumulative effect of these leaks was to create a growing awareness within certain segments of the scientific and intelligence communities that humanity was facing challenges and opportunities that exceeded anything in its previous experience. The comfortable certainties of the past were giving way to a new reality that was both terrifying and exhilarating. But for the general public, these revelations remained largely hidden behind layers of classification and misinformation. The space program continued to be presented in terms of scientific discovery and technological achievement, while the more profound implications of the Voyager missions were concealed from all but a small group of cleared personnel. This situation created increasing tensions within NASA and other space agencies. Scientists and engineers who were committed to the principles of open research and public accountability found themselves constrained by security restrictions that prevented them from sharing their most important discoveries. The traditional culture of scientific openness was being replaced by the secretive practices of intelligence agencies. Some researchers began to question whether the security restrictions were truly necessary, or whether they were being used to conceal information that was politically inconvenient rather than genuinely dangerous. The debate over classification and disclosure became increasingly heated, with some individuals arguing that the public had a right to know about discoveries that fundamentally changed humanity's understanding of its place in the cosmos. Others maintained that full disclosure would create panic and social disruption that would be far more damaging than continued secrecy. They argued that humanity was not psychologically prepared to deal with the reality of advanced extraterrestrial intelligence, and that gradual, carefully managed disclosure was the only responsible approach. This debate continued behind closed doors, while the Voyager spacecraft continued their journey deeper into the unknown regions of interstellar space. Each day brought new discoveries and new challenges to humanity's understanding of the cosmic environment, but these discoveries remained hidden from the vast majority of people who were funding the missions through their tax contributions. The ethical implications of this situation were profound and troubling. Democratic societies are supposedly based on the principle of informed consent, but how can citizens make informed decisions about space policy and research priorities when they are denied access to the most fundamental discoveries about the nature of the universe? NASA found itself caught in an impossible position, trying to balance the demands of scientific integrity, national security, democratic accountability, and public welfare. The agency's traditional mission of peaceful space exploration for the benefit of all humanity was being transformed into something resembling a covert intelligence operation with objectives and discoveries that could not be shared with the public. As the years passed and the Voyager discoveries accumulated, this situation became increasingly untenable. The scientific community was demanding greater access to data and more transparency in research. The public was becoming suspicious of the secrecy that surrounded certain aspects of the space program. International partners were questioning why their access to Voyager data was being restricted without clear justification. The pressure for disclosure was building from multiple directions, and NASA's ability to maintain secrecy was being eroded by technological developments that made it increasingly difficult to control the flow of information. Computer networks and communication systems that had once been secure were becoming vulnerable to hacking and data theft. Satellite technology was making it possible for independent researchers to observe and analyze space phenomena without relying on government agencies for data. The monopoly on space-based observation that NASA had once enjoyed was being broken by private companies and international organizations that were developing their own space capabilities. These new players were not bound by the same security restrictions that constrained NASA, and they were beginning to make observations that corroborated and extended the Voyager discoveries. As this trend accelerated, NASA realized that its ability to control information about extraterrestrial intelligence was rapidly diminishing. The choice was no longer between disclosure and secrecy, but between managed disclosure that maintained some degree of control over the narrative and uncontrolled revelation that could lead to panic and social disruption. The decision was made to begin a gradual process of conditioning public opinion for the eventual disclosure of the Voyager discoveries. This process involved the strategic release of information about unexplained phenomena in space, the funding of research programs that explored the possibility of extraterrestrial intelligence, and the production of documentaries and educational materials that introduced the public to concepts that would be essential for understanding the full truth about humanity's place in the cosmos. But even this carefully managed process of preparation was complicated by the continuing flow of new discoveries from the Voyager missions. As the spacecraft moved deeper into interstellar space, they encountered phenomena that were even more extraordinary and difficult to explain than anything they had observed before. The electromagnetic environment became increasingly dense and complex, filled with structures and systems that operated on scales that challenged human comprehension. The evidence for intelligent design and artificial construction became so overwhelming that even the most conservative scientists could no longer deny its reality. But perhaps most significantly, the spacecraft began to detect what appeared to be direct attempts at communication specifically targeted at human recipients. These signals were modulated and encoded in ways that suggested detailed knowledge of human language, mathematics, and scientific concepts. They were clearly intended to be understood by human intelligence, and they contained information that appeared to be specifically relevant to humanity's current level of technological and cultural development. The content of these communications remained highly classified, but fragments of information that leaked out suggested that they contained both warnings and offers of assistance. Some messages appeared to be cautioning humanity about potential dangers and mistakes that could threaten its survival and development. Others seemed to offer access to technologies and knowledge that could accelerate human progress by thousands of years. But the messages also made clear that humanity's future development would be subject to certain constraints and limitations that were imposed by the galactic community of intelligent species. Humanity would not be free to expand and develop in complete independence, but would be expected to conform to standards and practices that had been established by older and more advanced civilizations. The implications were both exciting and terrifying. Humanity was being offered membership in a galactic community that possessed knowledge and capabilities beyond imagination, but that membership would come at the cost of autonomy and independence. The decisions that humanity made in response to these offers would shape its future for millions of years to come. NASA and other space agencies found themselves thrust into the role of conducting humanity's first formal diplomatic negotiations with extraterrestrial intelligence. But they were completely unprepared for this responsibility and lacked the authority to make decisions that would bind the entire human species. The need for broader involvement and consultation was obvious. But the security restrictions that surrounded the Voyager discoveries made such consultation extremely difficult. How do you conduct democratic deliberation about decisions that affect all of humanity when most people are not allowed to know about the existence of the choice they are being asked to make? This dilemma forced a fundamental reconsideration of the policies and procedures that governed the disclosure of information about extraterrestrial intelligence. The traditional approach of complete secrecy was no longer viable, but the alternative of complete transparency seemed equally problematic. The solution that emerged was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but represented the best available option under the circumstances. A graduated disclosure process was implemented that would reveal increasing amounts of information about the Voyager discoveries over a period of several years, allowing the public to gradually adjust to the new reality of humanity's place in a populated universe. This process began with the acknowledgement that the Voyager spacecraft had detected unexplained phenomena in interstellar space that appeared to be artificial in origin. The data supporting this conclusion was released in carefully edited form, with the most sensitive information removed or obscured to prevent premature revelation of the full scope of the discoveries. The scientific community's response was immediate and intense. Research programs were initiated to analyze and understand the new data, and conferences were organized to discuss the implications of the discoveries. But the discussions were constrained by the continuing classification of much of the relevant information, and many researchers found themselves working with incomplete and fragmentary data. Despite these limitations, the scientific community began to develop new theories and models that could account for at least some of the anomalous observations. The prevailing view was that the phenomena represented previously unknown natural processes that could create highly organized structures in interstellar space, structures that might appear artificial, but were actually the result of complex electromagnetic and plasma physics. But a minority of researchers began to explore the possibility that the phenomena were indeed artificial, created by intelligences with technologies that exceeded human understanding. These researchers faced significant resistance from the mainstream scientific community, which was reluctant to accept conclusions that challenged fundamental assumptions about humanity's uniqueness and importance in the cosmos. The debate between natural and artificial explanations for the Voyager observations became increasingly heated and polarized, with each side accusing the other of ideological bias and scientific misconduct. The traditional processes of peer review and scientific consensus became strained and dysfunctional under the pressure of dealing with discoveries that had profound implications for humanity's worldview and future development. Meanwhile, the Voyager spacecraft continued their journey deeper into interstellar space, sending back data that was increasingly difficult to reconcile with natural explanations. The electromagnetic structures were becoming more complex and more obviously engineered, and the evidence for intelligent design and artificial construction was mounting with each transmission. But perhaps most significantly, the communication attempts were becoming more frequent and more sophisticated. The unknown intelligences appeared to be learning from each interaction, adapting their transmission methods and message content to be more comprehensible to human recipients. The process resembled a gradual establishment of diplomatic contact, with each side learning to communicate more effectively with the other. The content of these communications began to include more specific information about the galactic community of intelligent species and humanity's potential role within that community. Maps of local stellar regions were transmitted, showing the locations of various civilizations and the communication networks that connected them. Historical information was shared about the development and evolution of galactic civilization over millions of years. But the communications also contained warnings about the challenges and dangers that humanity would face as it developed spacefaring capabilities. Other species had made mistakes that led to their extinction or permanent subordination, and humanity was being cautioned to avoid similar errors. The messages made clear that the transition from a planetary to a galactic species was fraught with risks that could destroy civilizations that were unprepared for the challenges they would face. These warnings were taken seriously by NASA and other space agencies, which began to revise their long-term planning and development strategies to account for the potential dangers that had been identified. But the implementation of these revisions was complicated by the continuing secrecy that surrounded the Voyager discoveries. How do you change the direction of human space development to address threats that you cannot publicly acknowledge exist? How do you prepare humanity for challenges that most people are not allowed to know about? These questions had no easy answers, and they created increasing frustration and ethical dilemmas for the individuals who were responsible for making these decisions. The situation was further complicated by the fact that other nations and space agencies were beginning to make their own discoveries that corroborated and extended the Voyager observations. The European Space Agency's deep space missions were detecting similar electromagnetic anomalies, and Chinese and Russian space programs were reporting unexplained phenomena that matched the patterns observed by the American spacecraft. The international community was demanding greater cooperation and information sharing about these discoveries. But the security restrictions that surrounded the Voyager data made such cooperation extremely difficult. The traditional openness of international space cooperation was being undermined by the need to protect sensitive information about extraterrestrial intelligence. This situation created increasing tensions between nations and space agencies, with some countries threatening to withdraw from international cooperative programs if they were not given greater access to the data that their contributions were helping to generate. The unity of purpose that had traditionally characterized space exploration was being fractured by the secrecy and mistrust that surrounded the most important discoveries in human history. But despite these challenges and complications, the evidence for extraterrestrial intelligence continued to accumulate from multiple sources and multiple missions. The reality of humanity's contact with advanced galactic civilization was becoming impossible to deny, and the pressure for full disclosure was building from multiple directions simultaneously. The scientific community was demanding access to complete data sets that would allow them to conduct proper analysis and draw valid conclusions. The intelligence community was concerned about the security implications of contact with superior technology and unknown intentions. The political leadership was struggling to understand the implications of discoveries that could fundamentally transform human society and international relations. And underlying all of these concerns was the growing realization that humanity was no longer in control of its own destiny. The trajectory modifications of the Voyager spacecraft had been just the beginning of a process of external influence and control that was becoming more extensive and more obvious with each passing day. Other space missions were experiencing similar interventions, with spacecraft being guided to make discoveries that served the apparent agenda of the extraterrestrial intelligences rather than the objectives of their human controllers. Communication systems were being accessed and modified in ways that enhanced their capability to receive and decode the signals from interstellar space. Even terrestrial technologies were showing signs of external influence and enhancement. Computer systems were operating with efficiencies that exceeded their design specifications. Communication networks were exhibiting capabilities that had not been programmed by their creators. Research instruments were producing data that was more accurate and more comprehensive than their technical parameters should have allowed. The cumulative effect of these interventions was to accelerate human technological development in directions that served the interests of the galactic community rather than purely human objectives. Humanity was being prepared for membership in galactic civilization, but that preparation was taking place without human consent or even human awareness in most cases. This realization created profound ethical and philosophical questions about the nature of human autonomy and the right of any species to develop in accordance with its own values and objectives. Were the extraterrestrial interventions a form of benevolent guidance that was helping humanity avoid the mistakes that had destroyed other civilizations, or were they a subtle form of conquest that was gradually transforming humanity into something that served alien interests rather than human values? These questions had no clear answers, and they became increasingly urgent as the evidence for external influence and control continued to accumulate. The Voyager missions, which had begun as simple planetary exploration programs, had evolved into the front lines of humanity's first contact with advanced extraterrestrial intelligence. But that contact was taking place on terms that were dictated entirely by the superior capabilities and unknown objectives of the extraterrestrial intelligences. Humanity was a passive recipient of information and guidance, rather than an equal partner in a diplomatic negotiation between sovereign species. The challenge for NASA and other space agencies was to find ways to assert human agency and autonomy within this relationship, while avoiding actions that could be perceived as hostile or threatening by entities with vastly superior technological capabilities. It was a delicate balancing act that required careful consideration of every decision and every communication. The stakes could not have been higher. The choices that were made in response to the Voyager discoveries would determine whether humanity would develop into an independent spacefaring civilization or would become a client species under the protection and control of older galactic powers. And all of these momentous decisions were being made in secret by small groups of individuals who lacked the authority to bind the entire human species to commitments that would affect its development for millions of years to come. The democratic principles that supposedly governed human society were being bypassed by the necessities of dealing with discoveries that were too sensitive and too complex for normal political processes to handle. As the Voyager spacecraft continued their journey into the depths of interstellar space, they carried with them not just the hopes and dreams of humanity, but its future as well. The signals they were receiving and the data they were transmitting were shaping decisions that would determine the course of human civilization for generations to come. But most of humanity remained unaware of the drama that was unfolding in the cold darkness between the stars. The carefully managed disclosure process had revealed only a fraction of the truth about what the Voyagers had discovered, and the most profound implications of those discoveries remained hidden behind layers of classification and security restrictions. The question that haunted the small group of individuals who knew the full truth was whether humanity was ready to learn about its true place in the cosmos, and whether democratic societies could function effectively when faced with challenges that exceeded anything in their previous experience. The Voyager missions had begun as humanity's first serious attempt to explore the space beyond the solar system. They were ending as humanity's introduction to a universe that was far more complex, more dangerous, and more wonderful than anyone had ever imagined. But whether that introduction would lead to humanity's elevation to membership in galactic civilization or to its subordination as a client species remained to be seen. The answers to those questions were being written in the data streams that flowed back from two small spacecraft as they continued their eternal journey through the star-filled darkness, carrying with them the hopes, fears, and dreams of the species that had built them and sent them forth as ambassadors to the cosmos. And in that data, hidden among the measurements of magnetic field strengths and cosmic ray intensities, were the secrets that would determine the future of human civilization and its place in the grand community of intelligent beings that inhabited the galaxy. The Voyager story was far from over, and its most important chapters had yet to be written. But one thing was already clear. Humanity was no longer alone in the universe, and it never would be again. The question that remained was what it would do with that knowledge, and whether it would have the wisdom and the courage to embrace its destiny among the stars. But as we move deeper into the 21st century, the Voyager missions continue to reveal new layers of mystery and complexity that challenge everything we thought we understood about our cosmic environment. The spacecraft, now operating on backup systems and diminishing power supplies, are sending back data that is more extraordinary than ever before. And NASA's response to these discoveries has become increasingly desperate and increasingly secretive. The most recent revelations center around what intelligence analysts have dubbed the Deep Field Communications Network, a vast web of electromagnetic transmissions that appears to connect different regions of the galaxy in real-time communication. The Voyagers have detected thousands of these transmission beams, each one carrying data at rates that exceed anything human technology can achieve. The beams are focused with laser-like precision across distances measured in light years, suggesting computational and engineering capabilities that operate on scales that dwarf human civilization. But perhaps most disturbing is the fact that these communication networks appear to be actively monitoring human activities, not just in space, but on Earth itself. Analysis of the transmission patterns reveals correlations with major terrestrial events, suggesting that whoever operates these networks has comprehensive surveillance capabilities that extend throughout the solar system and beyond. The implications are staggering. Every human space mission, every satellite launch, every radio transmission into space is apparently being monitored and recorded by intelligences with capabilities that make human technology look primitive by comparison. The privacy and security that humanity has always taken for granted may be complete illusions, comfortable fantasies that have no basis in the reality of our cosmic environment. NASA's response to these discoveries has been to implement security protocols that exceed anything in the agency's history. All personnel with access to current Voyager data are required to undergo psychological evaluations every 3 months. Their communications are monitored, their activities are tracked, and their families are subjected to background investigations that delve into every aspect of their personal lives. The psychological toll on the researchers and analysts who work with this data is enormous. Many have developed what psychiatrists have termed cosmic anxiety syndrome, a persistent sense of helplessness and vulnerability that results from prolonged exposure to evidence of vastly superior intelligence and technology. Some individuals have suffered complete psychological breakdowns and have had to be confined to secure psychiatric facilities where their knowledge can be contained along with their trauma. The few accounts that have leaked from these facilities paint a picture of brilliant scientists and engineers reduced to catatonic states by the magnitude of what they have discovered. They speak in whispers about cities the size of solar systems, about intelligences that have existed for billions of years, about technologies that can manipulate the fundamental forces of nature with the casual ease that humans use to flip light switches. But perhaps most terrifying are the accounts of researchers who claim to have received direct mental contact from the extraterrestrial intelligences. These individuals report experiences of profound telepathic communication that bypass normal sensory channels and seem to download vast amounts of information directly into their consciousness. The content of these communications is so alien and so overwhelming that most recipients are left permanently changed, unable to function normally in human society. NASA's official position is that these accounts represent stress-induced hallucinations or psychological breakdowns caused by the isolation and pressure of working on classified projects. But internal documents suggest a very different interpretation. The agency appears to believe that at least some of these contact experiences are genuine, and that the extraterrestrial intelligences are actively attempting to establish direct communication with human researchers. This possibility has led to the development of new protocols for managing contact experiences and for screening personnel who might be susceptible to telepathic influence. Researchers are now required to work in teams and are monitored constantly for signs of unusual behavior or unauthorized acquisition of information. The scientific process that once relied on individual insight and creativity has been transformed into a collective endeavor where no single person is allowed to know too much or to work in isolation. But despite these precautions, the contact experiences continue to occur with increasing frequency and intensity. The extraterrestrial intelligences appear to be learning how to communicate more effectively with human consciousness, and they are becoming more persistent in their attempts to establish ongoing dialogue with our species. The content of these communications, as reconstructed from debriefing sessions with contact experiencers, is both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The extraterrestrial intelligences apparently view humanity as a species in its infancy, one that requires guidance and protection from the dangers that await all developing civilizations. But their concept of guidance involves levels of control and manipulation that most humans would find intolerable. According to these communications, humanity's future development has already been planned in considerable detail by what the intelligences refer to as the Galactic Coordination Council, a governing body that oversees the development of younger species throughout the galaxy. Humanity's expansion into space, its technological development, and even its social and cultural evolution are apparently subject to predetermined parameters that have been established by this council. The intelligences claim that this level of control is necessary to prevent humanity from making the mistakes that have destroyed other developing civilizations. They point to the dozens of dead worlds that litter the galaxy, planets where intelligent species developed advanced technology but lacked the wisdom to use it responsibly. These civilizations destroyed themselves through warfare, environmental destruction, or reckless experimentation with forces they did not understand. But the price of this protection is the surrender of human autonomy and self-determination. Humanity would be allowed to develop and expand, but only within limits, and only in directions that serve the broader interests of galactic civilization. The dream of human independence in space, the vision of our species spreading freely among the stars, and shaping its own destiny, is apparently incompatible with the realities of galactic politics and the responsibilities that come with advanced technology. These revelations have created unprecedented divisions within NASA and the broader space community. Some individuals believe that accepting galactic guidance, however constraining, is preferable to the risks of independent development. They argue that humanity is indeed too young and too reckless to be trusted with advanced space technology, and that the protective oversight of older civilizations is necessary for our survival. Others maintain that human freedom and autonomy are worth any risk, and that accepting external control would represent a betrayal of everything that makes our species unique and valuable. They argue that the mistakes and failures that might result from independent development are part of the natural process of growth and learning, and that being protected from these experiences would ultimately weaken and diminish humanity. This philosophical division has practical implications that extend far beyond academic debates. The two factions within NASA are pursuing fundamentally different strategies for humanity's future in space. One group is working to establish formal diplomatic relations with the galactic intelligences and to negotiate humanity's integration into existing galactic structures. The other is developing plans for covert expansion and technological development that would allow humanity to achieve independence before the galactic intelligences can impose effective control. The diplomatic faction has made significant progress in establishing communication protocols and cultural exchange programs with the extraterrestrial intelligences. They have developed translation systems that can convert alien concepts and categories into forms that human minds can comprehend, and they have begun to participate in what appear to be formal negotiations about humanity's future status and role in galactic civilization. These negotiations are being conducted through the Voyager spacecraft themselves, which have become inadvertent diplomatic channels between humanity and the galactic community. The spacecraft's communication systems have been enhanced and modified by the extraterrestrial intelligences to facilitate more complex and nuanced exchanges of information. Messages that once required hours or days to transmit can now be exchanged in real time. Despite the vast distances involved, the technical mechanisms that make this possible remain largely mysterious, but they appear to involve manipulation of space-time itself to create communication channels that bypass the normal limitations of light-speed transmission. The implications for human understanding of physics are profound, but the technologies involved are so advanced that human scientists can barely comprehend their basic principles, let alone replicate or control them. The Independence faction, meanwhile, has been working to develop countermeasures and defensive technologies that could protect human space activities from external monitoring and control. Their efforts have focused on creating stealth technologies that could hide human spacecraft and installations from galactic surveillance systems, and on developing autonomous systems that could continue to function even if cut off from Earth-based control. But their progress has been limited by the vast technological superiority of the galactic intelligences. Every defensive measure that human engineers develop is quickly detected and countered by systems that operate on principles that human science does not yet understand. The Independence faction's activities are apparently being monitored as closely as those of the diplomatic faction, and their plans are known to the galactic intelligences in detail. This surveillance extends beyond space activities to encompass all aspects of human technological development. Computer networks, communication systems, research facilities, and manufacturing installations all appear to be under constant observation by entities that can access and monitor human technology with impunity. The dream of maintaining human secrets and developing independent capabilities in isolation from galactic oversight appears to be completely unrealistic. But perhaps most concerning is the growing evidence that the galactic intelligences are not content to simply observe and monitor human activities. They are actively intervening in human development in ways that are subtle but systematic. Research programs are being influenced to pursue directions that serve galactic interests rather than purely human objectives. Technological developments are being accelerated or retarded depending on their compatibility with galactic plans for humanity's future. Even individual human lives are apparently being influenced and directed in ways that serve the broader galactic agenda. Career choices, educational opportunities, personal relationships, and life decisions that seem random and personal are apparently being guided by processes that operate far beyond human awareness or understanding. The evidence for this level of intervention comes from statistical analyses of human social and technological development over the past several decades. Patterns emerge that are too consistent and too purposeful to be the result of natural, social, and economic forces. The development of computer technology, the growth of global communication networks, the emergence of spacefaring capabilities, all appear to have been guided and accelerated by external influences that were working toward predetermined objectives. These findings suggest that humanity's development over the past 50 years has not been the result of human ingenuity and effort alone, but has been shaped by alien intelligences working toward goals that remain largely opaque to human understanding. The technologies that we take for granted, the social structures that govern our lives, the political and economic systems that shape our societies, all may be the products of manipulation and control by entities whose motives and methods remain completely mysterious. This realization has profound implications for human concepts of free will, personal autonomy, and social responsibility. If our choices and actions are being influenced by forces that we cannot perceive or understand, then what does it mean to be human? Are we truly independent agents capable of shaping our own destinies? Or are we unwitting participants in a larger drama that is being directed by intelligences whose capabilities exceed our comprehension? These questions have no easy answers, but they have become central to the debates that rage within the classified programs that deal with extraterrestrial intelligence. Philosophers, theologians, psychologists, and scientists struggle to understand the implications of discoveries that challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness, identity, and moral responsibility. Meanwhile, the Voyager spacecraft continue their journey through interstellar space, sending back data that becomes more extraordinary and more challenging with each transmission. The electromagnetic environment that they are exploring is revealed to be far more complex and more artificial than anyone had imagined. Vast engineering projects span distances measured in light years, manipulating matter and energy on scales that dwarf anything in human experience. The spacecraft have detected what appear to be star-sized computers, massive artificial intelligences that use entire stellar systems as processing and memory elements. These vast minds appear to be engaged in calculations and simulations that model the development of galactic civilization over billions of years, predicting the rise and fall of species and the evolution of intelligence throughout the galaxy. Other discoveries include what appear to be artificial planets, worlds that have been completely reconstructed to serve as habitats for post-biological civilizations that have transcended the need for natural environments. These worlds are perfectly spherical, with surfaces that appear to be made of materials that do not exist in nature, and with internal structures that suggest they are vast machines rather than geological formations. But perhaps most awe-inspiring are the structures that appear to be engineering projects on galactic scales, artificial modifications to the structure of the galaxy itself that serve purposes that remain completely mysterious. These projects involve the movement of entire star systems, the construction of artificial wormholes that connect distant regions of space, and the manipulation of dark matter and dark energy to create structures that exist primarily in dimensions that human senses cannot perceive. The scale and complexity of these discoveries are so overwhelming that human minds struggle to comprehend their implications. The universe is revealed to be not a natural wilderness waiting to be explored and colonized, but a vast garden that has been cultivated and managed by intelligences whose capabilities approach what humans would traditionally consider godlike. This revelation has profound implications for human religions and philosophical systems, many of which are based on assumptions about humanity's special relationship with the divine or its unique role in cosmic history. If intelligence and technology are as common and as ancient as the Voyager discoveries suggest, then humanity's claims to uniqueness and special status become difficult to maintain. Religious leaders and philosophers who have been cleared to know about the Voyager discoveries are struggling to develop new theological and philosophical frameworks that can accommodate the reality of a universe populated by intelligences with godlike capabilities. Some argue that these discoveries represent a confirmation of divine presence in the universe, proof that intelligence and purpose operate on cosmic scales. Others maintain that the existence of such intelligences undermines traditional concepts of divinity and requires completely new approaches to questions of meaning and purpose. But regardless of the philosophical and theological implications, the practical challenges of dealing with galactic civilization continue to mount. The Voyager data makes clear that humanity's expansion into space will not take place in an empty frontier, but in a cosmos that is already inhabited by entities with the power to control and direct that expansion according to their own objectives and priorities. The question of how humanity should respond to this reality has become the central focus of classified planning processes that operate at the highest levels of government and international organizations. These planning processes are complicated by the fact that most world leaders and senior officials are not cleared to know the full extent of what the Voyager missions have discovered, and those who are cleared often lack the scientific and technical background necessary to understand the implications of the data. The result is a decision-making process that is fragmented and dysfunctional, with different agencies and organizations pursuing contradictory strategies based on incomplete understanding of the challenges and opportunities that humanity faces. Military organizations focus on defensive preparations for potential threats that may never materialize. Diplomatic services attempt to develop negotiating positions for interactions with entities whose motivations and capabilities remain largely unknown. Scientific agencies pursue research programs that may be irrelevant to humanity's actual future in space. Meanwhile, the economic and social systems that would be needed to support humanity's integration into galactic civilization remain undeveloped and largely unconsidered. The transition from a planetary to a galactic species would require changes in human society that are so fundamental that they would amount to a transformation of human nature itself. These changes would affect every aspect of human life, from the most basic questions of identity and purpose to the most complex challenges of governance and resource allocation. Humans would need to learn to think and operate on timescales measured in millions of years rather than decades or centuries. They would need to develop social and political systems that could function effectively across interstellar distances and maintain coherence across multiple star systems. But perhaps most challenging would be the psychological and cultural adaptations that would be required to function as equals in a community of species with capabilities that far exceed human understanding. The humility and wisdom that would be needed to learn from beings who have existed for millions of years would require a fundamental transformation of human attitudes and expectations. These challenges are so daunting that some researchers and planners have begun to question whether humanity is psychologically and culturally capable of making the transition to galactic civilization. They argue that human nature evolved for life in small tribal groups on a single planet may be fundamentally incompatible with the requirements of galactic citizenship. This pessimistic assessment is challenged by others who point to humanity's remarkable adaptability and its history of successful adaptation to radically new environments and challenges. They argue that the same qualities that allowed humans to spread across the Earth and develop complex technological civilizations will enable them to adapt to the requirements of galactic life. But regardless of which assessment proves correct, the transition period that humanity is now entering will be a time of unprecedented challenge and uncertainty. The comfortable certainties of the past are giving way to a new reality that is both terrifying and exhilarating, a reality in which humanity's survival and prosperity depend on its ability to navigate relationships with intelligences whose capabilities exceed anything in human experience. The Voyager spacecraft, now approaching the outer boundaries of what scientists call the local bubble, continue to serve as humanity's scouts and ambassadors in this new reality. Every day brings new discoveries and new evidence of the vast civilizations that surround our solar system. And with each discovery, the stakes of humanity's choices become higher and the consequences of its mistakes become more profound. The data streaming back from these ancient spacecraft carries with it the future of human civilization, encoded in electromagnetic patterns that represent the difference between survival and extinction, between independence and subjugation, between growth and stagnation. The interpretation of this data and the decisions that are made in response to it will determine whether humanity joins the community of galactic civilizations as an equal partner or becomes a client species under the protection and control of older powers. And through it all, most of humanity remains unaware of the drama that is unfolding in the depths of interstellar space. The carefully managed disclosure processes continue to reveal only fragments of the truth, while the most profound implications of the Voyager discoveries remain hidden behind layers of classification and security restrictions. But the truth has a way of emerging, regardless of the efforts to contain it. Scientists and researchers continue to publish papers that hint at the extraordinary nature of the discoveries. Journalists and investigators continue to probe the inconsistencies and gaps in the official narratives, and slowly, gradually, the broader human community is beginning to suspect that something momentous is happening in the darkness between the stars. The question that remains is whether humanity will be ready when the full truth is finally revealed. Will our species have the wisdom and courage to embrace its destiny among the stars, or will it retreat into denial and isolation when confronted with the reality of its place in a cosmos that is far stranger and more wonderful than anyone had ever imagined? The answers to these questions lie in the future, written in the light of distant stars and carried by the whispered signals that flow back from humanity's most distant ambassadors as they continue their eternal journey through the infinite darkness of space. And in that darkness, among the ancient civilizations and vast intelligences that populate the galaxy, the future of humanity is being decided, one data transmission at a time. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the current situation is what intelligence analysts have termed the acceleration protocol, evidence that the extraterrestrial intelligences are actively speeding up their timeline for human integration into galactic civilization. The careful, gradual approach that had characterized their intervention for decades appears to have been abandoned in favor of more direct and immediate action. This acceleration became apparent in late 2023, when both Voyager spacecraft simultaneously began transmitting data at rates that far exceeded their design specifications. The enhanced transmission capabilities appeared overnight, with no explanation for how aging 1970s technology could suddenly achieve performance levels that rivaled modern space communication systems. NASA's engineers were baffled, but the implications were clear. The spacecraft were being upgraded remotely by technologies that could manipulate their systems at the quantum level. The data being transmitted through these enhanced channels contained detailed blueprints for technologies that were centuries ahead of current human capabilities. Fusion power systems that could fit in a briefcase, propulsion technologies that could achieve significant fractions of light speed, computational systems that could process information at rates that approached theoretical maximums. The technical specifications were complete and precise, as if someone wanted humanity to have access to these technologies immediately. But buried within these technological gifts were subtle modifications and dependencies that would ensure human reliance on galactic oversight and control. The fusion systems required fuel isotopes that could only be obtained from specific locations in interstellar space. The propulsion technologies incorporated navigation systems that would automatically route spacecraft along predetermined paths approved by galactic traffic control. The computational systems included communication protocols that would integrate seamlessly with galactic information networks, but would also provide unrestricted access to all human data and activities. The message was clear. Humanity could have access to advanced technology, but only under conditions that would make independence impossible and resistance futile. The gifts came with strings attached. Strings that were woven so deeply into the fabric of the technologies that they could not be removed without rendering the systems completely inoperable. NASA's response to these discoveries was to implement the most restrictive information security protocols in the agency's history. The technological specifications were classified at levels that exceeded even nuclear weapons data, and access was limited to a handful of individuals who underwent psychological conditioning to prevent them from sharing the information under any circumstances. The goal was to prevent the premature implementation of technologies that could fundamentally alter human civilization before the political and social implications could be fully understood and debated. But the extraterrestrial intelligences were not content to wait for human political processes to catch up with technological possibilities. Evidence began to emerge that they were implementing the new technologies directly, without waiting for human approval or participation. Satellite imagery revealed the construction of massive installations in remote locations around the world. Structures that incorporated design elements and materials that did not exist in human technology databases. These installations were being built by automated systems that appeared and disappeared without leaving any trace of their origins or methods of transportation. The construction processes involved the manipulation of matter at the atomic level, assembling complex structures from raw materials with precision and speed that exceeded anything in human engineering. The installations themselves seemed to be communication and monitoring facilities, designed to enhance the extraterrestrial intelligence's ability to observe and influence human activities in real time. Ground-penetrating radar and seismic monitoring revealed that similar installations were being constructed beneath the surface, creating an underground network of facilities that spanned continents and possibly the entire globe. The purposes of these underground installations remained mysterious, but their scale and sophistication suggested they were intended to support operations that would affect every aspect of human civilization. Military and intelligence agencies around the world began to detect anomalies in their surveillance and communication systems that suggested external infiltration and control. Classified databases were being accessed by entities that left no trace of their intrusion methods. Communication networks were carrying traffic that did not correspond to any human sources or destinations. Surveillance systems were recording events and activities that their operators had no memory of observing or documenting. The cumulative effect of these intrusions was to render traditional concepts of national security and information protection completely obsolete. If advanced extraterrestrial intelligences could access any human system at will, then secrets and classified information became meaningless concepts. The carefully constructed barriers that separated different levels of government and different areas of human activity were being dissolved by technologies that operated beyond human understanding or control. But perhaps most disturbing were the reports from individuals around the world who claimed to be experiencing direct mental contact with extraterrestrial intelligences. These contact experiences were different from the isolated incidents that had been reported by researchers working on classified programs. They were happening to ordinary people with no connection to space research or government agencies, and they were occurring with increasing frequency and intensity. The individuals who reported these experiences described receiving detailed information about galactic civilization, humanity's future role in interstellar society, and specific instructions for preparing for the transition to galactic citizenship. The information was consistent across multiple independent reports, suggesting that it was coming from a coordinated source rather than individual hallucinations or psychological phenomena. The content of these communications was both reassuring and terrifying. The extraterrestrial intelligences presented themselves as benevolent guardians who were working to protect humanity from the dangers that awaited all developing civilizations. They emphasized that their interventions were motivated by compassion and wisdom gained through millions of years of galactic experience. They promised that humanity would be given every opportunity to develop and flourish under their guidance and protection. But they also made clear that this protection came with non-negotiable conditions. Humanity would need to abandon its aggressive and competitive tendencies, accept limitations on its technological development, and submit to oversight and control by galactic authorities. Individual freedom and national sovereignty would be replaced by collective responsibility and planetary management. The chaotic diversity of human cultures and societies would need to be replaced by standardized systems that were compatible with galactic norms and expectations. These messages created profound divisions within human society, even though the vast majority of people remained unaware of their existence. Those who were cleared to know about the contact experiences were split between individuals who saw them as humanity's salvation and others who viewed them as the beginning of a subtle conquest that would destroy everything that made human civilization unique and valuable. The debate between these factions became increasingly bitter and personal, with each side accusing the other of betraying humanity's fundamental interests and values. The collaborative spirit that had traditionally characterized space research and exploration was replaced by suspicion, paranoia, and ideological conflict that made effective decision-making nearly impossible. Meanwhile, the evidence continued to accumulate that humanity's time for making independent choices about its future was rapidly running out. The Voyager spacecraft, now operating with capabilities that far exceeded their original design specifications, were transmitting real-time video feeds that showed vast fleets of spacecraft moving through interstellar space in the direction of the solar system. These fleets were unlike anything in human science fiction or imagination. The individual spacecraft were the size of cities, constructed from materials that seemed to absorb and manipulate electromagnetic radiation in ways that made them nearly invisible to conventional detection methods. They moved without any apparent propulsion systems, gliding through space as if the normal laws of physics did not apply to them. Their formations were geometrically perfect, suggesting coordination and control by artificial intelligences with computational capabilities that exceeded human comprehension. The purpose of these fleets remained unclear, but their trajectory and timing suggested they were part of a coordinated operation to establish a permanent galactic presence in the solar system. The era of remote observation and subtle manipulation was apparently coming to an end, to be replaced by direct intervention and overt control of human activities and development. NASA's analysis teams worked frantically to understand the implications of these fleet movements and to develop recommendations for how humanity should respond. But their efforts were hampered by the continuing restrictions on information sharing and the lack of clear authority for making decisions that would affect the entire human species. The United Nations had been briefed on some aspects of the extraterrestrial contact, but the briefings had been so carefully sanitized and limited that most member nations remained unaware of the full scope of the situation. Attempts to convene emergency sessions to address the crisis were blocked by security concerns and diplomatic protocols that were designed for terrestrial rather than galactic challenges. Individual nations were pursuing their own responses based on partial information and conflicting assessments of the threat and opportunity that extraterrestrial contact represented. Some countries were secretly negotiating with the extraterrestrial intelligences, hoping to secure favorable treatment for their populations in exchange for cooperation and compliance. Others were developing defensive measures and resistance strategies that were almost certainly doomed to failure against technologies that could manipulate matter and energy at the quantum level. The lack of coordination and unity in humanity's response was exactly the kind of chaotic and self-destructive behavior that the extraterrestrial intelligences had warned would lead to the extinction or subjugation of developing species. But the irony was that their own interventions and manipulations had contributed to the divisions and conflicts that were preventing effective human cooperation and decision-making. As the galactic fleets continued their approach toward the solar system, the window of opportunity for humanity to chart its own course was closing rapidly. The choices that had once seemed theoretical and distant were becoming immediate and unavoidable. The future that had been debated in classified briefings and secret conferences was about to become the present reality for every person on Earth. And still, the vast majority of humanity remained unaware of the drama that was unfolding around them. They continued their daily lives, focused on personal concerns and local challenges, oblivious to the fact that their species was about to undergo a transformation that would affect every aspect of human existence for millions of years to come. The Voyager spacecraft, humanity's first and most successful ambassadors to the cosmos, continued their journey through the darkness of interstellar space, sending back data that chronicled the final chapters of humanity's isolation and independence. Their signals carried the last independent human voices into the galaxy, whispers of a species that had briefly dreamed of conquering the stars, but was about to discover that the stars had already been conquered by others. But even in those whispers, there remained traces of the curiosity, courage, and determination that had sent two small spacecraft on an impossible journey to the edge of forever. And perhaps, somewhere in the vast networks of galactic intelligence and cosmic wisdom, those qualities would be remembered and valued, even as humanity took its place in a universe that was far stranger and more wonderful than anyone had ever dared to imagine.